Okay, so some of you were in the training the other night. So just real briefly, my name is Dee Wilson. I live in Tacoma. I've lived here for about more than 20 years. I worked in the state child welfare system under different names from 1978 to 2004. I don't mean my different names, but the different names for the agency there, right? And I then went to the University of Washington School of Social Work. I ran a training and research institute there for 5 years from 2005 to 2010. I taught in the MSW program. I was head of the CTEP program. And I then went to Casey Family Program for 6 years and worked in a section called Knowledge Management there in the Seattle downtown office. And then I left and retired from there. And since 2016, I've been doing training in the Washington State through the contract with the Alliance, the Training Alliance. And this critical thinking training is one of the trainings I do for DCYF staff. And I have done it for several years. And I've done this training in various versions of this, probably for, more than 10 years, maybe a little bit more than that. So, and I guess what I want to say about the training before we start is that critical thinking is a big subject. And so anything, and I do a half-day training on this, and I always tell staff, this is a big subject. You know, if I taught an MSW class for 10 weeks at the University of Washington, I would have plenty of material. So the idea that anything you're going to do in half a day, much less in 90 minutes, it's going to be an idiosyncratic version of a very big subject. And you're going to find that I have a little bit of a different take than maybe some other trainers would have. So I place a lot of focus and emphasis on self-reflection, on self-awareness. And we're going to talk a lot here about bias. So I guess and also I just want to say about this Zoom format, you know, this is obviously hard to have some kind of interaction. Still, we're going to make an effort here. And you can put comments in the chat box or questions, or you can just speak up and interrupt. And so I guess what I want to do initially here is I just want to ask what kind of concepts or associations you have with critical thinking. I mean, excuse me for a second, I'm gonna have to unplug my phone here. When you talk about someone that you know being a good critical thinker, or maybe you don't think that they're very good at critical thinking, what are you saying about the person? What kind of association do you have with the concept? And here we're not looking for right answers. We're just looking for, this is a big subject, and so just seeing what kind of ideas you come with. And so you can, hold on, I got to get in my chat box here. And so I think about teens making poor decisions, and of course that would probably be true of all of us from time to time. Unbiased research. Okay, we're gonna talk a lot about bias here this morning, so we're gonna come back to that. Ask clarifying questions. Yes. Critical thinking, seeing a situation from different perspectives. Having an open mind. So this is along the lines of dealing with bias here. Basing decisions on a wide array of information. That's a good thought. We're going to come back to that. Not giving in to groupthink. Ability to consider concepts outside your bias. Yes. Or able to see multiple perspectives. Yeah, like one of the things when I do a day-long version of this training, and one of the sections of the training I do is seeking alternative explanations for behavior. That is, so a lot of times be very aware of behavior, and it can have child behavior, for example, and it can have a variety of different kind of causes there. Problem solving, what a lot of people in DCYF say when they're in this training is they say things like thinking outside the box, and they're really talking there about kind of creative problem solving kind of ideas. Mary Bartley, attempting to evaluate a situation from all angles and, from a variety of perspectives, not just making knee-jerk decisions. That's going to be a big theme of what I have to say here in a few minutes. And so any other ideas on this subject? We could probably go on, because this is a big subject, as all of you are probably aware of. Mike, analysis, breaking things down, synthesis, interpretation, looking for patterns. Yeah, the part of the training I do, we're not going to probably have time to do it today, but the last part of training I do for DCYF is on pattern recognition. And sort of that, to me, that is the sort of the embodiment of expertise in any field, not just in child welfare, but it would be true in medicine, law, in any kind of area. Experts see patterns that non-experts do not see. And so there's a great book on that subject, and I will, at the end of this training, I'll give you, if you're interested in that, I'll give you some information. And by the way, I do have a PowerPoint on this particular subject, and I told that I use in DCYF training, and I will send that after this training's over. I'll send that PowerPoint to Ryan, and he can post it or send it to you or whatever he wants to do there. So what I want to do here initially is I just want to give you a couple of my thoughts on the subject just briefly, and then we'll go on and we'll do kind of a little bit of an exercise here. So when I think of critical thinking, the first thing I think of is taking a hard look at evidence. And that is asking hard questions of people about their beliefs and applying the same standards that we apply to other people to ourselves, like asking ourselves hard questions about the grounds for our beliefs. And so part of what it means, if you ask, I was at the School of Social Work for 5 years, taught in the MSW program there. If you ask most scholars for their ideas about critical thinking, one of the things they're going to say right off the bat is making critical distinctions. So that's a function of critical thinking, being able to sort of separate out different kind of concepts that just make for confusing thought if you conflate them. So for example, in child welfare, in the last decade or two, it's become common to make a strict distinction between risk and safety. When I worked in the agency, that really wasn't true. In the permanency area, the area that all of you are dealing with a lot of times, making a distinction between legal permanency and relational permanency. In the child protection realm, knowing the difference or being able to make a distinction between risk of imminent harm, that is, kids are in danger right now, we have to do something right now to protect their lives, versus kids being harmed cumulatively, little by little over a long period of time. And that's the sort of, I do a lot of training on neglect, and that's a lot of times what happens with kids who are chronically neglected over long periods of time. Even if they're not seriously injured, a lot of them, they're very, very developmentally and emotionally harmed over long periods of time, but not immediately. It's not a lot of times that the kids are in danger. I think it's also important to understand kind of the emotional context for this, so many of you have been CASAs for a long time. I talk with caseworkers. Some of them haven't been on the job less than a month. Some of them have been on the job for many years. Caseworkers, particularly the experienced ones who've been around the agency for a long time, they have almost all had the experience of being wrong about something that's really important, that really affects the lives of parents and children. And so they end up feeling guilty, they have regrets, but they also understand that they're vulnerable to error unless people, decision makers, and one of the themes that I want to talk about today is most of us are way overconfident in our judgments, and not just, and that includes the field where we're experts in, but particularly when we don't know anything about other fields. People are phenomenally sure that they have the answers to things that they don't know anything at all about. And that's not just sort of a flaw of personality, particular people or something. That's how the human mind operates, as we're going to talk about it here in a minute. It's overconfident about its snap judgments. And so until people have sort of a sense of that you're vulnerable to error, then critical thinking is just kind of an abstract kind of a concept or something. It only takes on a kind of an emotional gut meaning when you've actually had the experience of being wrong about something really important. And then you look back and think about, well, how could I have been so wrong? How could I have thought that in the light of 2020 hindsight? I guess a couple of other things I want to say, in addition to sort of the individual habits that make for critical thinking, that improve our ability to think clearly about issues and problems, there is also a social sort of framework, a social milieu aspect to it. And so particularly for people who work in agencies, if the organization you work in has little tolerance for critical thinking, there isn't going to be a lot of it. And so, for example, what would I mean? Well, one of the most obvious aspects, I worked for Casey Family Programs for 6 years. That program has some of the best staff in the country. On all, they have tremendously impressive staff, but they have an organizational culture that doesn't care for critical questions. And so, right off the bat, I could see that when I worked there. And so, when I worked there, I had to be very careful. You have to be very careful about the kind of things you ask and how you ask them, your tone of voice. There just is you can work in an organizational culture that has a limited tolerance for critical questions. And when that is true, there isn't going to be a lot of critical thinking. So there really has to be sort of a social framework kind of idea, a social milieu, social support kind of thing. It's important to have a degree of humility about knowledge. I mentioned that I worked for Casey for several years. I worked in a section called knowledge management, and we would receive questions from around the country about all manner of every subject in child welfare from A to Z. And most of those management teams wanted some kind of authoritative opinion from us about the nature of research on every topic you can think of under the sun in child welfare. And they also were very interested in what other states were doing. In fact, they were more interested, generally speaking, in what other states were doing than they were interested in the research. But, when they would ask us the research questions, maybe half the time the actual best answer would be, we don't know. And those child welfare teams around the country, that was an answer that they didn't want. They didn't, why are we coming to you? I mean, why are we coming and asking you, who are supposed experts in the subject, if you're just going to tell us we don't know? So there's a tendency a lot of times for experts to pretend to have knowledge that they do not have, or to pretend that they know a little something, and then they begin to generalize, and that is a real persistent kind of tendency of the use of expertise in any field, and it has particularly been really important in this state and other states around through the years in child welfare. So some subjects in child welfare are super well researched. So a lot of you deal in the permanency area. There are probably 700 studies over 30 years on reunification. It's one of the, we know more about reunification than practically anything else in child welfare. On the other hand, if you talk about in-home safety planning, we know next to nothing from the standpoint of research. Well, that's kind of a big gap. Knowing next to nothing about something of great importance. And then we know just a huge amount about reunification, not that, generally speaking, policymakers are paying any attention to it, or that we're actually putting lessons from research into practice there, but the knowledge is there in some areas. In some other areas, it actually is not there. So, so that's just kind of for starters here. And so I guess the idea I'm trying to get across here is that critical thinking involves cognitive skills, obviously. It's a way of implying intelligence to problems, but it's more than that. It has an emotional component to it. And it particularly has, great importance on the capacity to reflect on one's own thought processes here, to be self-reflective about how we came to a decision, and honest with ourselves and honest with other people. One of the values that I would emphasize in any kind of critical thinking is that reasoning has to be transparent. And so this is just a sort of a lesson for all of us. I don't care if you worked in child welfare for one day or for 30 years. When you have a sort of come to a decision about a case, you have to be able to explain it clearly to people. And if you cannot explain it clearly to people, you either don't understand it yourself, or you have some kind of agenda. So that would be sort of, and so there are these, it's not just a matter of being smart. Critical thinking isn't just a matter of being sort of as quick and as smart and as deductively powerful as Sherlock Holmes. That's just, that's a wrong idea. I mean, as much as I like the Sherlock Holmes book, it's not really a very good model of critical thinking there. So with that, I guess I want to ask you, I want to pose a scenario here. So imagine that in the next week or two, you're going to participate in staffing on a permanent plan for a child who's been in foster care for close to 2 years. And for most of that 2-year period of time, the child has been with a non-kin foster parent. and has done pretty well in that setting as far as we can tell. And now some non-relative from out of state who's never met the child has contacted the child welfare agency and said that they want to adopt the child because they're family. And now there's going to be a meeting, and the meeting is going to include several people, including you, and you have an opportunity then to prepare for this meeting. So the question is, if you had the opportunity, which of these three choices would you choose? So first, if you had the time, would you read everything in the record? I mean, even if it was very voluminous, if it was hundreds of pages, if you had the time, would you flip through the whole 500 pages of a voluminous record as a way of preparing for this very important, that this is going to be a life-changing decision for this child? So if you were going to take part in a meeting on that subject, would that be your choice? Or would you do almost exactly the opposite? Would you say, no, that's not how I make decisions. I really want to read summaries. I'm either going to go to summaries and case records, or I want someone to summarize it for me. And I don't want more than a couple pages of the most pertinent, important information in this case. So here, this is a kind of a radically different kind of choice. It's the difference between reading a few hundred pages and reading a couple of pages. And then you might say, well, no, I don't like either of those ideas. I want someone to tell me a story. And I hope it's an interesting story, but it's also a story of someone who knows the family, the child, the people involved really well. And I want someone to sort of summarize the case information, not in terms of some ideas like risk factors or things like that. I want to hear a story about how we got to where we are. What is this child like? What is the personality of the child? What's the care been like? How did the kid get into care? I want to hear a story about that. So now, granted that all of us would probably use all three of these methods from time to time. And by the way, this isn't a right answer thing. I'm just asking for a preference here. So if you had a choice, how many of you would choose to read? You had the time, you would read the whole complete record, even if it was a few hundred pages. How many of you would do that? And you can either put this in the chat box or you can speak up. So Anthony, the whole record. What about the rest of you? Whole record. Yes, the whole record. So a lot of you would read the whole record, right? So who would say, no, I would rather read a summary? Hopefully a good summary, but I would rather read a summary. Who would do that? So this is interesting. I do this exercise all the time with ECYF staff, and I really never know exactly what they're going to say, which that's very surprising. If you do training of subjects over years and you do exercises, most of the time you get pretty standard responses from groups, but this is one exercise where I've never got a standard response. So Sarah says a story or summary may have agenda behind it. Yeah, well, we're going to talk here in a minute about the pros and cons of this, but first I just want to get ideas. So how many of you would go for the story? So Sarah says a story. Kaylin says a story. How old is the child? The child is about 2 in this scenario, this imaginary thing we're talking about here. Okay, so let's talk about, for those of you who would read the whole entire record, why would you do that? Why would you go to the trouble of several hours of reading the whole entire record if you had the option?
First of all, I think there may be things in there that are very important. And second, I can form my own opinion. I don't have to listen to somebody else's summary or to somebody's story. They may put their own ideas into it. So I rather trying to make my own objective decision.
Okay, and so you would want to know all the information insofar as you could, and you would want to decide how to weigh the information, or
yes,
decide whether the various elements are true or credible or not true and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Nicole says, I'm very interested in the details, and a lot of us are. Getting as much info as possible. And so this is something we're going to talk about more here. So for some people, more information in decision making, more information is better than less. But there's a whole bunch of people for whom the opposite is true. That is, less information is better than more information in decision making. So this is a area where people just don't see it kind of the same way, right? So for some people, more is better in terms of decision making. For some people, more is definitely not better. But for people who would read everything, they like lots of information. They want to decide how to interpret it for themselves. They want to decide how to weigh the various pieces of information. And then, of course, I think the other thing you find out when you read records, particularly lengthy ones in child welfare, is some things that people that start to be contained in summaries, someone put in a record way back when, a long time ago, and maybe it was highly questionable, but it's just because it's stated again and again in court documents over and over again, it comes to be taken as true when it was questionable in the first place. And unless you read the record, you would never know that, of course, right? We'll come back to Linda says, I would rather talk to multiple involved people, but that's sort of the idea of the staffing. You would be talking to multiple involved people in the context of the staffing here. So let me ask, I've already, is there a downside to reading everything? I've already mentioned that for some people, more information is not better than less. So for some people, having more information is kind of overwhelming. It doesn't help them to clarify decision-making. It just is a confusing thing. And particularly if you're reading hundreds of pages of stuff. Now I can just say that when I worked for the agency, for the Child Welfare Agency in this state for years and years, one of the standard strategies that headquarters people used when there were going to be discussions of funding, which tended to be kind of heated, a lot of emotion there because you're talking about millions of dollars, right, in terms of budgets. If headquarters wanted to put a damper on that kind of conflict, all they had to do ahead of time was to send out a few hundred pages of data ahead of time, because of course they know people aren't going to have time or patience to read through all that data. And yet it is going to contain all kinds of information that might be relevant to the funding discussion, right? So people are a little cautious about making all kinds of claims if they haven't read all the information there, right? Jeff says the downside is the time commitment, sure, and that's why, and we're going to come back to the summary thing in just a minute here. So that's a tremendous issue when you work in child welfare, the time issue. So how about as far as, now, a couple of other things about the, particularly about reading everything that's in a record. I mean, for the most part, what you're going to find is 99% of it isn't going to have any value in decision making. I mean, that's ultimately, even if you read everything, you're going to end up basically discarding most of it from the standpoint of having an influence, right? So you're spending a lot of time to come out with what you think are the most relevant pieces of information there, right? And you're also going to become aware that a record is not exactly sort of a documentation of facts. It's a documentation of perspectives, of, you know, it's people's take on facts as they have become, if they've interacted with family members, with kids over a period of time. And so I think one of the effects of reading records a lot of times is just to wonder how credible it all is. Because some of it seems really very factual. Some of it just seems like really totally opinionated. You know, I remember when I was a regional administrator, I'd be sometimes in these contested cases that finally would come to my desk. I would be reading through a record and I'd read 50 pages of supposed assessment information. And then I'd see a note in the margin that said scumbag exclamation mark, you know? So, you know, the person who's putting all this supposed factual information in the case record just has really strong feelings about some of the parties. So of course it makes me wonder how factual all the rest of it was, right? So how about as far as summaries? Now, of course, there's time, and let me tell you about summaries. This is how people with authority make decisions. 100% of the time, they read summaries. And that is, of course, a lot of function of time. But I found over the years as I began to do that, I began to prefer summaries. And particularly if they were well done. And the reason was, of course, they clarified issues very, very quickly. They sort of got rid of the 99% of garbagey stuff there, and particularly if they're well done. So powerful people at all levels, middle management and up, heads of agencies, senators, presidents, they're not reading reports, they're not reading documents or records, never. They're reading summaries. And whoever is preparing those summaries has been given a lot of power. So those staffers who work behind the scenes for senators, for presidents, for Congress people, the head of DSHS, the ECYF, those are very powerful, influential people, but no one really knows who they are. Because, of course, they're framing the decision-making for those decision makers, for the policymakers. They're framing it by the kind of information that they're giving to the person who's making the decisions there. So summaries, of course, obviously can be very well done. They can be done, so to speak, competently, and they can also be extremely manipulative. And for someone reading a summary, how would you know? How would you know? I mean, it's a matter of who do you kind of trust here around, is the summary one competent? That's one thing, meaning is it getting at the pertinent information here? And second, is it honest, fair, and balanced? And of course, it's very easy for someone who's preparing a summary to try to tilt the playing field in the direction that they want it to go by the kind of information that they're transmitting to the person who's making the decision, or whatever kind of interpretation they're putting on that information, right? So summaries turn out to be very powerful influence in the way decisions are made, and yet they have all kind of inherent issues and flaws with them that I've just mentioned. And then so let's talk a little bit about stories. Why do we like stories? And just about everyone does. What's the power of stories here? An emotional reaction. Yeah, stories have an emotional effect on people. They give more of an emotional context to what's happening to people rather than sort of dry factual information about the person. Better idea of character, that's true. Stories, if they're done well, are interesting. Why do people who are trying to influence other people tell stories? You know, I mentioned a couple of days ago, you know, I used to do training where I gave people initially a lot of data, and a lot of times I would lose groups in 15 minutes. They'd just switch off because a lot of people have very little tolerance for data, but people have a lot of tolerance for stories. A lot of people love stories. And so if you want to really convince someone of something, if you want to influence their decision making, you tell them a story. And then at some point, maybe you give them a little bit of data, a little bit of factual information, a very, very little. You tell them a story. It's not a rational way to make policy, but it's the way we persuade other people to our point of view. And of course, one of the things about stories is that it's easy to have implicit biases in stories. And sometimes if a storyteller is very, very skilled, it may even be hard to immediately identify what that bias is if the storyteller is a skilled person. Yet there is a bias a lot of the time. So stories are very persuasive. They're very emotional. Stories connect the dots. That is, they don't just give you some information, they sort of tie the information together. And so B follows A, C follows B, and sort of an understandable, logical kind of a sequence kind of there. Story gives a picture to follow in their minds, yes, so, I mean, the kind of TV shows we're watching, novels we're reading, stories we're reading, movies we're watching, they're telling stories. Stories about people. Includes inferences, absolutely, interprets data, and that's not so bad in and of itself. It's the idea sometimes that it's implicit rather than explicit. So in a way, a story is always interpretive. It's never merely, this is just a factual account of what happened to me, right? Now, a couple other things about stories, just real quick. I mentioned that stories can be interesting or stories can be kind of boring. Some of you probably have family members that tell get together at holidays and tell really boring stories that go on for a long time, right? So storytellers tend to prioritize that is, they're looking for the interest of an audience. And so stories tend to get shaped over time. Stories that are told over and over again get shaped by the reactions of an audience. And so anytime that anyone is interested in a story, you probably should ask yourself the question, well, wow, that's a fascinating story, but is it true? Because storytellers tend to prioritize interest over truth. And just to tell what that means, so maybe a few years ago, I was listening to an interview with Terry Gross, this woman on NPR who does these interviews with authors, celebrities, and has done it forever, seemingly. And she was talking to a guy who had written a memoir about his early life. And she's talking to the guy for an hour, and he's got all kinds of stuff. And at the end of an hour, she says to him, wow, this is such a fascinating story, but I just have to ask you, is everything in this book true? And the guy pauses for a second, and he says, well, let me put it this way. I never let a fact get in the way of a good story. So, you know what the guy's saying? It's a fictionalized memoir. I mean, a lot of it probably is true. And the sort of the general spirit of it may be true. But in terms of all the factual things being true, no. And the guy was just admitting that. So yeah, so very, very hard with stories to figure out what part is true and what part is in there just because it gets a reaction from audiences, kind of thing there. Mary, journalists use a combination of getting the facts and interviewing people. Yes, I talk to journalists around child welfare issues. I give them a lot of information, data. I send them reports. You know what they always want? They always want me to connect them with a kid or with a parent or with somebody who is going to tell them a story, because they want to lead off their article, their news story, with a story about a person. They don't want to start off with some data. And if they're going to have some data, it's going to be supportive to the story in some kind of way, and it isn't going to be a lot. So that's journalism. And that's kind of the difference between being a journalist and being a scholar, by the way. It's scholars a lot of times are not going to behave like that. And so that's a lot of times why people don't read scholarly studies. But if we're making social policy, only a very foolish person would make it on the basis of stories. And yet it's done all the time, day in and day out. But that's not a rational approach to how you develop social policy. That's where you do need data. And you need to step back and take a dispassionate look at information around hundreds of thousands, millions of people, not a single person a lot of the time. So, okay. So why do I start off with this exercise here to try to get this across? Because anytime you're a decision maker, you are assimilating, you're processing information in some way. There's no royal road to the truth here. You're processing information in some way, and the way you're processing information has some benefits. That's why you're doing it that way. That's why you have a preference for either reading everything or hearing stories or summaries or whatever it is. But every way that you're processing information also has a downside. Every way you're processing information has a downside. And so to become a better self-reflective decision maker, you need to know what the downside is, and you need to have a strategy for correcting for the downside, whatever that is. And so that's sort of thinking about, so I guess the idea I'm trying to get across is part of critical thinking is thinking about thinking. It's thinking about thinking. How did we get through this thought process to where we are in terms of a decision, and be able to go back and reflect on that in terms of being a better kind of a decision maker over time. So let me stop there before I change the subject here, and see if anyone has comments or questions. You can speak up. You can put it in the chat box if you want to. Tim says cameras and video can be helpful, but this can be manipulated. So this is really interesting to me, the power of these videos in recent years. Wow. And you know what the power of the videos is a lot of the time is it just cuts through denial. It cuts through denial. How could any thoughtful, educated American adult be unclear about police violence directed at African American people? How could that even be possible living in this country? And yet it is possible. And yet those videos, wow, over the last 5 or 6 years, they've had a tremendously powerful effect. And it's not like they're giving us some information that we didn't have before. They're actually giving us vivid examples of it. And of course, they can be manipulated in various ways. And of course, they will be. So let me see. Any other kind of thoughts here on how we process information? I'm going to say a lot more about this in the next part here. So let me just start here. So let's talk a little bit for a second about bias here. So in normal usage, what does it mean to say that someone is biased or to admit that I'm biased? What does bias mean in normal usage, right? If you were to say of a friend of yours, that's a biased person on this particular subject. Slanted, yeah. What else would you say about bias? Slanted means they're not exactly interested in a fair, balanced discussion of it. So 8 miles high, a person with a bias has a preferred outcome. Yes, that just about is always true. Strong opinions are not open to other opinions. So let me talk about that for a second. You can have strong opinions but not be biased. But people who are biased usually do have strong opinions, right? And the quality that makes those opinions biased is that the opinions are fixed. That is, in normal usage, if we're talking about bias, we mean a person whose mind is made up. Don't bother me with information. They're not going to be convinced by evidence. Nothing that you could say that in terms of an argument, a rational argument, is going to get to them, right? Because their mind is made up. That's sort of the quality of bias right there. It's not having a strong opinion per se. You can have a strong opinion and be open to new information, or you can have enough intellectual integrity that you feel that you really have to deal with evidence in some way. You really do have to either have an argument or you have to change your mind. That's having intellectual integrity. But a biased person, no. The world is a certain way. They understand what that is. They don't need any more information. Their mind's made up. That's it, right? Biases are learned. Yeah, absolutely. Usually based on anecdotal evidence. We'll come back to that here in kind of a minute, okay? So the kind of bias that I want to talk about here now, though, is a little bit of a different kind of a bias. And this is called heuristic bias. And so you spell that Heuristic, heuristic. Heuristic is a shortcut. So it's a word that isn't in normal usage, actually, but it has a really kind of a simple meaning. A heuristic bias is a way of processing information that systematically leads to error. So again, it's not focusing so much on the content of a belief, as in sort of a racial bias or a bias about gender identity or something like that. I mean, it's a bias about how it's in the nature of how you process information. That's a heuristic. And the reason I focus on this bias is because there is a great book to refer to. And so this book is Thinking Fast and Slow, the Daniel Kahneman book that came out in 2011. I have this book right here. Some of you can maybe see it. It's available in paperback. And amazing as it sounds, this Daniel Kahneman book, Kahneman is a cognitive psychologist. He won the Nobel Prize in economics, behavioral economics, several years ago, which was absolutely a first. And so this book, which came out in 2011, was on the New York Times bestseller list for a year. And this book is kind of a discussion of 30 years of research in cognitive psychology. So how could and summarizes a lot of really dry study. So how could a book like that be on the bestseller list for a year? And so the answer is because he summarizes the research in cognitive psychology by telling a story. because Kahneman, of course, understands the power of stories. And so the story he tells about the human mind is a story of two characters. And the characters are System 1 and System 2. And since these are kind of unappealing, ugly names, if you don't like, I don't like them particularly. If you don't like System 1 and System 2, you can talk about automatic thinking and deliberate thinking. System 1 and System 2. And so what Kahneman would admit right off the bat is this is a fiction. This is a scientific fiction. It's not really that that our minds have these two characters somehow, but he's engaging in kind of a little bit of a fictional kind of account of the science in order to elicit reader interest, because we're interested in conflict. If you think about the stories we pay attention to on TV and movies and novels and so forth, all of them, 100% of them, they're about conflict, all of them. So Kahneman understands that. So he's telling us a story about the conflict of these two sort of ways of functioning, so to speak, in terms of the characters. And the most interesting character by far in this story is System 1. So System 1 is the automatic thinking function of the human mind. And so here's what Kahneman has to say about it. If you're awake, it's always on. Your System 1 is on from the time you open your eyes in the morning till you go to sleep at night. In fact, you cannot turn it off. There's no turning off System 1. So System 1 generates intuitions, desires, impressions, feelings, fragments of thoughts, and it's always doing that. And why is it always doing that? Because it's responsible for your personal safety and the safety of people you love. So your System 1, its first, so to speak, job is to protect you. So it's always on. It operates extremely quickly. It's associated with intuition. It's highly emotional. It's a system and an engine, so to speak, for jumping to conclusions. And one of its peculiar characteristics, and the thing that makes it sort of problematic from the standpoint of decision making, is that it's radically indifferent. This is Kahneman's language. It's radically indifferent to the quantity and quality of information. System 1, I will say this again. System 1 is radically indifferent to the quantity and quality of information. So he has an acronym for that. And the acronym is, so it's what you see is all there is. WYSIATI, the acronym. What you see is all there is. So what that means is that System 1 takes very small amounts of information and it connects, so to speak, the dots between those elements of information into a story. And then it jumps to a conclusion immediately. And you don't know how your intuition comes to these conclusions so quickly, but it does. And the other interesting thing about our System 1 is that for the most part, it works pretty darn well. Most of us, many of us here in our 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe older, we wouldn't be sitting here unless our System 1 were pretty damn competent most of the time. Because again, remember, our personal safety depends on it. So because our System 1 works so well, and we don't know how it works, how do we come up with these intuitions like in a split second about whether a person we're meeting is dangerous or not, or whether the situation, something's going on that doesn't seem right? How do we figure this out like instantaneously, as in the snap of a finger? That's System 1 at play there, right? System 1 is not into ambiguity. It's not into uncertainty. It's not into a sort of a back and forth debate kind of thing. Takes a small amount of information, connects it very quickly into a story, and it reaches a conclusion. So it's the way people make decisions under time pressures. That's why System 1 is so important. Whenever there's time pressures, you don't have an opportunity to, if you're deciding, you're driving a car on the freeway on I-90 and you have to decide whether you're going to merge with traffic, you're not sitting there debating it. I mean, you're making a very quick decision based on your driving experience. Your System 1 is operative. And that's a lot of times the way things in life kind of work there, right? Okay. System 1, however, has some downsides, apart from the ones I've already mentioned. And it's very sure of itself. It's very confident. People who have System 1 kind of intuitions are sure they're right. And in fact, there's an amazing number of intelligent adults in this country and other countries around the world who seem to believe that if they have a strong conviction, it must be true. That is, if they believe something, and boy, they know in their gut it's right, well, it's right because their gut tells them it is. And they even think that that's sort of a standard of truth or something. But of course, it's not. So system one is right a lot of the time, but it can be wrong. And it particularly can be wrong in certain types of cases that we're going to come back to here in a minute. And then there's system two. And system two is analytical. It's slow. It's deliberate. And it's vain because it thinks it's in charge of the mind. It thinks it's in charge of system one because it has veto power in certain instances over the impulses that come out of system one. But of course, for the most part, that's false. For the most part of what system two does is it rationalizes the desires of system one. It tells us, yeah, absolutely, I want that cookie, and here's why I should have it. And here's how I'm going to get it. That's what system two does most of the time, but it also can do the other thing. It can say, no, I'm on a diet. I'm trying to cut calories. That would be a violation of my diet. And so, yeah, it can delay impulses as well, but it generally kind of doesn't. One of its main characteristics is that it's lazy. And particularly compared to system one. Remember, system one has infinite energy. If you're awake, it's on. It's never tired, never runs out of steam. System two, on the other hand, it runs out of steam really, really quickly. And so the tendency is not to use system two, deliberate, analytical kind of thinking unless you have to. If system one is giving you the answer, why would you use system two that has limited amounts of energy? And so to give you an idea of how this works, because this is not intuitively obvious to people all the time, I'm going to give you this little puzzle from the Kahneman book on page 44 of the Kahneman book. And so here's what Kahneman says. Here's a simple puzzle. Do not try to solve it, but listen to your intuition. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? I'm going to read this again. A bat and a ball cost $1 and a dime. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And then Kahneman says, a number came to your mind. What is the number? Intuitively, what number came to your mind there, if any did? $10. Nicole says 10. Yes. So a number came to your mind, and Kahneman says the number, of course, is 10 cents. The distinctive mark of this easy puzzle is that it evokes an answer that is intuitive, appealing, and wrong. Do the math and you will see. If the ball costs 10 cents, the total cost will be $1.20. 10 cents for the ball and 1.10 for the bat, not 1.10. The correct answer is 5 cents. Okay, this little puzzle that Kahneman is offering here, it's not testing your math skills. It's not that hard a puzzle. If you have a piece of paper there, you can probably come up with the right answer really pretty quickly. It's testing your willingness to use your system two if system one is already giving you the answer. That is, if your intuition tells you immediately the answer to this little puzzle is 10 cents, why am I going to sit down and use a paper and pencil about it or think about it any further? Why am I going to use up limited amounts of energy there when I already know the answer? The answer is 10 cents. It just turns out to be that's a wrong answer. So the question is, of course, to what extent the test is, to what extent are people willing to think analytically, deliberately, carefully about problems that they think their system one has already solved? They already know the answer. Why do I need any more of an assessment of this situation? I already know what the truth is. Right? So that's the sort of the system one, the system two dilemma. So to give an example of how this kind of works, if you give people a system, and this has been done a lot of the time, you give people a system two task, like a little math quiz that most of us are not used to doing. You give the people a paper and pencil. You give them a minute or two to work on it. And then someone walks into the room with a couple of snacks. And on one platter, you've got some cookies, freshly baked chocolate chip cookies right out of the oven. And on the other platter, you have some freshly cut orange slices. And you tell people who are doing the little math test, you can have one of these treats, but not both of them. The more people are engaged in system 2, the more they will choose the unhealthy treat. System 1 has a sweet tooth, literally. System 2 craves glucose. It's losing energy. It has limited stores of it. System 1 has unlimited stores of energy. So we only, the idea here is that we only use system 2 if we think we have to, and we only use it to the extent that we think we have to because it's exhausting. So system 2, however, has its own kind of a downside here, apart from the ones that I already mentioned. Remember, it's vain, it's lazy, but it also a lot of times is compartmentalized. So there's a famous experiment in cognitive psychology where some of you who were at grad school in the last 20 years or so maybe saw this video. So you put a couple of teams out on a basketball court. And one of the teams is dressed in white jerseys and one of the teams is dressed in black jerseys. And you give the team some basketballs and you tell them to pass the basketballs among themselves. And then you put some students on the sideline and tell them to count the passes from one team to the other team. And while all of the group is engaged in this exercise, a person dressed in a gorilla suit wanders onto the basketball court for 9 seconds. And doesn't just run across the court, that is, cavorts around the court for 9 seconds. So then runs off the court. So then at the end of the exercise, the researcher asks the student observers on the sideline, how many of you saw the gorilla? And this, by the way, this experiment has been repeated many, many times. The usual answer is about half the students saw the gorilla. Half the students didn't see the gorilla, and they don't believe there was a gorilla until they see the video. So sort of the lesson that Kahneman draws from this is that it's blind, and it's possible to be blind to our blindness. It's possible to be blind to our blindness. Why does system 2, for some people, operate like that? Because it has the capacity to compartmentalize. That is, it has self-programmed itself to look for basketball passes. It isn't expecting, anticipated, or interested in finding gorillas on the basketball court. It's interested in basketball passes. That's what the person sees because they programmed their mind to see it like that. Some people are just not as able to do that. And so they may say that's sort of an indicator of focus there. I mean, some people are tremendously focused. Some of you probably remember that Bill Clinton was famous for being able to do 4 or 5 things at one time. Supposedly his wife was always getting on him about because he was never just talking to you. He was doing 2 or 3 other things at the same time. So he had a tremendous ability to compartmentalize his mind there, right? And lots of us do, and some of us don't have as much of a capacity there, right? Okay, so before I draw some child welfare applications to this, and let me stop and see if anyone has comments or questions. T. Joy says, I watched the video the other day and was surprised to rewatch and see the gorilla. I truthfully, I have to say, I haven't seen this video, but at some point I'm going to watch it. I read about it, but I haven't seen it. Kaylin says, it seems with people who are consistently stressed or burnt out, their system 2 runs out frequently. Yes. And so there's been a lot of work now in behavioral psychology on this particular subject. So people who are exhausted, people who are fatigued, people who are overworked, people in child welfare, generally speaking, are overworked. One of the first reactions to that situation is to develop tunnel vision. That is, you begin to see fewer things. So being stressed or fatigued or overworked over a period of time, it literally detracts from IQ. We become less smart over time if we're subjected to that situation on a chronic basis. So it's like sort of the difference. Some of you probably on this, some of you are sports fans. If you do, probably you watch NFL games on Sunday. So one of the first things that, of course, happens to quarterbacks when they get stressed out is that they can't see the field. They have plenty of talent at throwing the ball, but they can't see the field. So that is, they can only see a receiver. They cannot scan the field looking for options there. That's the same way decision-making works in child welfare and a lot of other fields. The more stressed out we are, the tireder we are, the more fatigued, the more overworked we are, the more we see, we narrow our range of attention. That's how the mind works. We have tunnel vision right there. Okay, so just a sort of a child welfare application here. So maybe 20 years ago or so, a woman named Eileen Monroe, who was a philosopher of science at the London School of Economics, she published an article in a major child welfare journal in this country on child fatalities, and this article was named Common Errors in Reasoning and Child Protection. And what Monroe had done in England was to go back and look at 45 child death cases in England that occurred between 1975 and 1994. And these cases had been reviewed by multidisciplinary teams in England. That is, that they had been very thoroughly reviewed by lots of very well-informed people. So they had very comprehensive, full, detailed accounts of the fatalities and of the events that led to the fatalities. Well, what did Monroe find in that study? She found that in about 25% of cases, she couldn't find that anyone had done anything wrong, even though a child had died. But in about 75% of cases, there were some errors, and sometimes they were very egregious errors. And the most egregious error by far was that once caseworkers in England had made up their mind about risk and safety issues, they were very loath to change it in response to new information. They were very resistant to listening to information that suggested that they might be wrong. So this is confirmation bias, and it is the most powerful heuristic bias in child welfare, in medicine, and law, in everything. So in terms of decision-making and judgment, everyone has to be aware of the power of confirmation bias. So how does this work? Once we've made up our mind about something, so you have system one, for example. System one is an engine, a cognitive engine for jumping to a conclusion. Once we have jumped to a conclusion, we defend the conclusion. We stubbornly stick to the conclusion, no matter how erroneous or mistaken it is. That's confirmation bias. Okay, and that's what Monroe found out was going on in England. People were very rational, very thoughtful about assimilating information about risk and safety to the point at which they had made a judgment, and they had declared that judgment in some kind of social milieu where they had put their reputation on the line, whether that would have been in a court hearing or in a staffing. So now they have said, I think X about this case and about risk and safety issues with this child. At that point, they're looking for information that they're right, and they're ignoring information that they're wrong. And they're doing that in a systematic way. And so the thing that makes it very hard to defeat confirmation bias is that the person who's biased always thinks that they have evidence for their judgment. And the truth is they do, because they've gone looking for it. They've gone looking for evidence that supports their views, and they've ignored evidence in a systematic way that would refute their views. So yeah, they're biased from their standpoint. They have reason to believe it. No matter how crazy the idea is, they have found some reason to believe that this is true, right? So this is confirmation bias. So one of the ideas that I'd like to sort of get across here today is no one in this world, and I don't care how smart you are, can defeat confirmation bias on your own. Confirmation bias defeats everyone. If they are working in isolation, or if they're not interacting with people who just are going to be able to tell them, well, you're just not right there, or your reasoning is flawed. And so I guess the idea I'm trying to get across here is truth-seeking, not only in science, but in practical affairs, like in child welfare. It is a social enterprise. And that is, I want to say this again, getting at the truth of things is a social enterprise. Why is it? Because otherwise, confirmation bias defeats everyone. That's everyone, regardless of IQ. And so being aware of confirmation bias, it's not a function of having 160 IQ or something. It's a function of being self-reflective. It's a function of being self-reflective. And so one of the things we need to think about in child welfare then, or in the kind of work that you are doing, is then how do we correct for and control for confirmation bias? And so I want to stop here and see whether you have thoughts or questions on that particular issue. Given the fact that confirmation bias is tremendously powerful and it distorts decision-making in really a brutal way, what can we do to control for that? What do you think? Yeah, seek feedback from others. You have to do that. You have to be able to, and I've already mentioned the importance of being transparent about your reasoning. You have to be able to seek feedback from others, and you have to be able to listen to critical feedback. Not rude feedback, not insulting feedback, not people yelling at you, but you have to be able to listen to people who have a different perspective in terms of the way they interpret information and evidence than you do, right? And so there has to be some kind of ability, and this is what any kind of an organizational environment that supports critical thinking, this is what has to be going on. There has to be an opportunity to have critical interchange around major key ideas, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of practice and in terms of specific cases. If there cannot be a critical interchange, in other words, if you can't disagree with people publicly in a courteous way, there cannot be any critical thinking in that agency. So that's what I mean by the importance of the social milieu. It's important to slow down. I want to say this again, particularly controlling system one reactions. Remember, system one is an engine for jumping to conclusions. Once we jump to conclusions, we don't reason as well. So anyone who wants to be a better decision maker has to be able to pause, to stop the rush to judgment there. You know, when I was, before I ever read Kahneman years and years ago, I was a caseworker for a lot of years and then a supervisor and manager. And I used to wonder why was there so much tension in just being able to withhold judgment there? Because I noticed it in myself. I didn't understand the reason for it, but I could understand that there was kind of an anxiety, an uncertainty. It didn't feel right. I was ready to reach a decision, but I was trying to stop myself from doing it. And I couldn't understand where the tension was coming from, kind of thing, right? That's system one at play. That's how system one operates. So particularly to become a better decision maker, and particularly the less experience one has, the more true this is. You have to be able to withstand the sort of the initial impulses and ideas of system one, slow down, think carefully and deliberately about that before you reach judgment. Many times it means widening or increasing the amount of information you have. Sometimes it means that. Sometimes it means listening to other people who may not agree with you. Sometimes it just means taking a couple of days to think over the whole thing. You know, when I was a manager for years, people used to come up to me on the floor and say, God, I want to do X, I want to do Y, Z. You know, well, very quickly, I learned as a manager to say, I'll think it over. You know, I learned not to ever give them an answer right on the spot. Right? Just because, you know, a lot of times if I acted impulsively, I was going to do something that I later felt was wrong there. So look for resources. Heidi says, look for resources from a range of different places and people. In other words, look at multiple perspectives. That's part of the reason we staff cases. Now, Kahneman has some very good insights on how to avoid groupthink and staffings, because of course, if you bring people together, but they engage in groupthink, that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting multiple perspectives at all. You're getting a single perspective that's the product of groupthink. So one of the things that Kahneman says, for example, is that if you want free discussion at a meeting, before you ever start, you have people write down, if they already have sort of an opinion, a judgment, a sort of an inclination, you have them write it down on a piece of paper and you put it in the middle of the table before you ever elicit any kind of discussion at all. And then you take the pieces of paper out of the table and you elicit sort of the reasons why people had those views, right? So what you're trying to do is to stop the first person who talks in the meeting, or the person who talks the loudest in the meeting, or who has the most authority in the meeting, or who has the most status in the meeting, from just determining how the staffing goes by immediately, right off the bat, declaring their views. And then everyone else just piles on. So there is a way to run groups and there's a way to run meetings that encourages critical thinking. And there is a way to run them and operate them that discourages critical thinking, right? Talk about the issue by the experts, supra, yeah. You want to run this by, and particularly, I want to say this again, the more inexperienced people are, because you have a strong gut feeling doesn't mean you're right. So particularly you want to be running that by whatever that view is, someone who's more experienced than you are. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily right and you're wrong. It's just you want to listen to their perspective. You want always a devil's advocate in an organization, in a unit, in a meeting. Someone has to be willing to say the yes buts. If everyone just piles on to some opinion, there isn't going to be any critical thinking in that meeting. Collaborate, accept supervision, yes. And of course, you have to operate with the understanding that you may be wrong. And we all are from time to time. So you might think about why it is that adults in this country, it's got to be other places as well, but I don't live other places. Why is it that adults in the United States are so concerned about being wrong, so insistent that they're right all the time? None of us are right all the time. All of us make errors, grievous errors, both in professional life and our personal life. So intellectual integrity is the capacity to admit that we're wrong. It's not stubbornly insisting that we're right. It's the ability to admit that we're wrong, particularly in the face of evidence for which we have no comeback. So that's what it means to have intellectual integrity. That is, I look at the full range of evidence, and if I don't have a good answer, I think about changing my opinion, right? Okay, so that's, now the other bias that works a lot of times in child welfare, very, very powerful, is what Kahneman calls halo effect. And the halo effect goes something like this. If I like someone I'm working with or a friend, someone in my life, then they can do no wrong from my perspective. If I don't like them, they can do no right. They have no virtues. And so this is sort of halo effect. So if I'm supportive of the person, then I'm supportive of their behavior, their opinion, their position, whatever it is. And if I don't like them, I'm not supportive of them. I take the opposite opinion there. You know, that just is such a crude way, a crude view of life and everything. You would wonder, how can adults, you know, with college degrees, how could they think like that? And yet I found when I worked in child welfare that caseworkers' feelings about parents and about children had a tremendous impact on decision making. Whether a caseworker liked a mother, didn't like her, thought a father was a scumbag or not, or, you know, those kind of feelings of like and dislike just had a tremendous influence on what they wanted to do with the case. So it just takes a lot of, let me just say that it just takes a lot of effort in any kind of, in life in general, but also particularly in child welfare, be able to separate our feelings about people from our judgments about their behavior. Those are not the same thing. We can love someone and recognize that they screwed up. And in our intimate family life, we do that all the time. You know, we don't think about family members that they're always right or always wrong. We know better. We know them up close and personal. But sometimes in professional life, we don't operate kind of the same way. And so again, the ability to separate one's feelings about a parent or parents and children from judgments about their behavior, that's an important thing to do in decision making. And so let me see how much time we got. We have 15 minutes. So I guess what I want to do now is I want to show you a book real quickly. And the name of this book is Decisive, and it's How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work. And the authors are Chip Heath and Dan Heath. So these are a pair of brothers. This book is not about child welfare. It's mostly around business. To a certain extent, it's around personal life. The reason I like this book, and this book does have a lot of stories. So the Kahneman book's kind of hard going a lot of the time because it's summaries of, but the Heath book is easy to read. You can probably read it in 2 hours, and it really develops kind of an acronym for how you improve decision making. And that acronym that they use is WRAP, W-R-A-P. And so I want to talk a little bit about it. And the reason I like this book is because it incorporates the information and insights from Kahneman and other of Kahneman's colleagues. And at the same time, it applies it in a way that is very useful and helpful in terms of developing skills. And so I want to go through what this RAP thing means real quickly. And so I've already mentioned, before I get into RAP, I want to say this one more time. If you want to become a better decision maker, the first thing you learn to do is to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. You postpone judgment till you have more information. Okay, the second rule, and this is the W part of the RAP thing, is you widen your options. Sometimes that means gathering more information. This is particularly true for caseworkers who are going out on cases. You want them to not make safety decisions until they have an adequate amount of information, or not just a very thin amount of information. But it also means that they widen their decision-making options. So what the Heath brothers are saying is, in important matters, both in professional life and in personal life, don't get stuck with doing either A or B. Don't bring decision-making down to some dichotomy. And so, for example, in child protection, that dichotomy might mean we're either going to leave the child in the home, that is, we're not going to place the child, or we're going to place the child. So the dichotomy would be place or don't place. What the Heath brothers are saying is, don't get stuck with that kind of choice. Always try to broaden or widen your options. Think very carefully about what some other alternatives would be. Which is not to say you can still decide that the child ought to be placed. You can still decide the child should not be placed. But you don't do it in terms of an either or kind of thing. So that's the W part of it. The R part is reality check. And that, of course, goes back to the confirmation bias thing, because, of course, the Heath brothers are very aware of the power of confirmation bias. And so we've already talked about some strategies for controlling that. And maybe we'll come back to that in a second. So that's the R part, WR. A is attained distance. And it's attained distance from short-term desire. So here, I guess this is a little more of a complicated kind of thing, but just to explain this a little bit. So if you're going to become a better decision maker, I've already mentioned, you have to be able to separate your feelings about people from judgments about their behavior. If you're a caseworker who's interested in doing a good job of risk assessment or safety assessment, you have to separate your predictive judgments about the likelihood of some event happening in the future from a wish fulfillment fantasy. So you need to separate predictive judgments from fantasies. And most of those fantasies are wish fulfillment fantasies. That is, I'm a Seahawk fan. I wish the Seahawks would win every Sunday. But I'm not crazy enough to bet my income that they will, or even betting the line on them, right? So as a bettor, as a gambler, if I'm going to, keep from losing my shirt, I have to be able to separate what I think is going to happen from what I would like to see happen. Those are not the same thing by any means. And so the ability to do it, and those little fantasies, by the way, they're incredibly powerful. And they're powerful because most of us, I would say all of us in this culture, we have literally been subjected to hundreds of thousands of ads over the years. I mean, so if you look at, and sometimes at night, I'll watch CNN for a few minutes. Any ad on TV that has even 30 seconds, they're trying to engage you in some kind of a fantasy. They're showing you some little bit of a story, and they're trying to engage you in a fantasy. I could be like that person. I could have a $35,000 car and drive out to the edge of the Grand Canyon. I could do all those things, right? That's how fantasy works. And so need to be able to control that. And then we need to be able to separate our facts, our factual information that we have about a case from our values. And that just turns out to be, I don't have enough time to talk about this at length, but this turns out to be very, very difficult to do. So being able to separate facts from values, separate feelings from judgments about behavior, and separating predictive judgments from wish fulfillment fantasies, right? So that's the R part. That's the attained distance part. And finally, the P part is the prepare to be wrong. And so one of the really good things about the Heath book is that it just has all kind of stories about the fallibility of experts. And so it just turns out that experts aren't much better at predicting the future than the rest of us are, even if we're non-experts, right? The thing that distinguishes an expert from a non-expert is not that they can predict the future better than we can, is that they have a better knowledge of base rates. So the sign, the sort of the indicator of expertise in any area of work is a knowledge of base rates. And so I'll send Ryan some information about this. So an example of a base rate in child welfare, for example. So your CASAs, you have a role in reunification decisions and so forth. So as in that kind of a role, you ought to know that the average reentry into care rate is 12 to 15% in 12 months, and it's 25 to 30% in 3 years. So that's a base rate for reentry into care post reunification. An expert knows that. A non-expert may not know it. And so one of the things that I've tried to do with training over the years in child welfare is just to bring the new caseworkers up to snuff on some of the base rates that they really ought to be aware of. What does it mean in terms of, you guys go through case records, you'll see a risk assessment from time to time. What does it mean to say that a kid is high risk or that a family is high risk? And so what it means in an actuarial system is that about 40 to 50% of the time, that case is going to be re-reported. That family will be re-reported to CPS within a 12-month period of time. That's concretely what high risk means. That's a base rate for high risk. To talk about a family being low risk, that means that the family would be re-reported less than 20% of the time within a 12-month period of time. So that's what I mean by base rates. The base rate for CPS re-report is 20 to 25% in 18 months. So an example there. So what a person, a skilled decision maker does, knowing that everyone is fallible when it comes to predicting the future, is what the Heath brothers said is they will set up a tripwire. They will identify indicators that tell them that their decision was probably wrong. So instead of engaging in confirmation bias, where they receive some information that suggests that maybe they were wrong, they stubbornly defend their decision. No, a skilled decision maker sets up an indicator that tells them that they're wrong, and they go check it out. And so, for example, in reunification, one of the issues that's always going to come up is relapse. You want every caseworker, everyone who works around people who have drug and alcohol problem, to know the indicators of relapse. That's what I mean by tripwire. So when families fail to show up for appointments, when they were reliable and then they aren't, when they're lying to you about their behavior, those are indicators that probably the person has relapsed, something that is very commonplace in child welfare. So caseworkers need to be aware of that, and they need to be able to recognize it. And of course, what you want someone to do when they hit that tripwire, so to speak, in terms of relapse, you want them to go find the kid immediately, not 24 hours from now. As soon as you recognize that the relapse has happened, someone needs to go check on the safety of kids immediately. So that's the sort of the meaning of it. So that's the acronym, WRAP. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say is I'm going to come back to this pattern thing for just a minute here and say that the interesting thing about patterns and the ability to recognize patterns is that for genuine experts, for people whose expertise has been developed over long periods of time, many of those people do operate in terms of intuition. They are able to use their system one in an expert way. A lot of times they do have the answer, the right answer, very, very quickly. So what experts are doing is engaging in what a guy named Gary Klein, a colleague of Klein, not as famous, but he's written a book called Sources of Power, How People Make Decisions. And those are naturalistic studies of decision making. That is, he looks at what people actually do, not what someone says they ought to do. What he finds about expert decision makers is that they depend a lot on intuition, and they are able to recognize patterns in a holistic way, and they have an operational response at the ready. Okay, no one who comes into child welfare, no one, or into any other profession, has that in the early stages of their career. That kind of expertise is developed over a period of many years, and you have to be constantly exposed to these patterns over and over and over again to recognize them accurately. So there is a way to recognize relapse. Everyone who works in child welfare, around child welfare, all of you, you should be able to recognize the signs of relapse within the year of coming in to the work, right? Self-sabotage, that happens in permanent planning constantly. That's a pattern that everyone who works in child welfare should be able to recognize that, because those are very common patterns. They happen over and over again. Some things that happen in child welfare are not as common, and so people don't encounter them as much. And so for that reason, they're harder kind of to recognize, because the whole idea of how you develop the capacity to recognize patterns is you have to be exposed to them, and you have to have someone who understands them to point it out to you. And so generally speaking, what Kahneman says, for example, and Klein, is that generally takes a chess master 5 to 6 years. Person has to play chess 5 or 6 hours a day for 5 to 6 years to become a chess master. Even if they are genetically equipped to be a great chess player, they still have to play chess. They still have to work at it. They have to work at it hard, and they have to work at it a long time. And at some point, it does become intuitive to them, but not in the early stages. And so any caseworker in the first year or two that is depending on their gut reactions, I went a few years ago, I went to a state in the Southwest to do training, and I found out that in their training center, they're actually training new caseworkers in this state to trust their gut. They're actually being trained to do that, right? No, you want to train new caseworkers not to trust their gut. Go talk to your supervisor, talk to an experienced peer. After 5 or 6 years, maybe you start to trust your gut. And if we want to hurry up that sort of learning experience in child welfare, then we have to do that through coaching, through some very conscious kind of way of exposing people to patterns more frequently. And in child welfare, those patterns consist of 4 main elements, as I mentioned the other night: poverty, substance abuse, chronic mental health conditions, and DV. Those are the big 4. There's lots of other things that happen as well. Those are the big 4. Most serious cases in child welfare involve combinations of those 4 factors and all kind of different versions of it. And so little by little, people become to recognize what these kind of patterns are, but they have to be exposed to them. It's not a matter of taking part in a training program, reading a book, listening to a lecture like I'm talking now. You actually have to be exposed to the pattern. And someone has to point it out to you, and little by little, you come to recognize it. And so what experts can do that non-experts cannot do is that they recognize patterns immediately, and they have an operational response at the ready. And I mentioned the operational response to relapse is go find the kid right now. The operational response to self-sabotage is find out whether the person is engaging in denial or whether they're conscious of what they're doing. If they're engaging in denial, you have to chip away at denial. If they're conscious of what they're doing, you can just have a conversation with them. So it's 11:30. I'm going to stop. I mentioned that I have the PowerPoint that I am going to send Ryan that has a lot of the information, particularly around the holistic pattern recognition thing that I've been talking about here the last few minutes. It has scenarios to sort of point out how that actually works here, right? And I also sent you guys, I don't know whether you got it or not, but I sent Ryan a handout before this training that was a summary of the Kahneman book. And so again, I recommend the Kahneman book highly, and it's just to say one more thing about the Kahneman book, it's not a book you read from page 1 to the end. It's you find certain sections of it. I've read certain sections of the Kahneman book a dozen times, but I've never read it from page 1 to the end. It's not that kind of book. On the other hand, it's a book that repays study. On the other hand, you can read the Heath book in 2 hours, and it's interesting, enjoyable. You will learn something that's valuable to you, but it's it's not like reading Kahneman. So, okay, so I think with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to give you an email address. My email address is deewilson13@aol.com. I'd be glad to respond to anyone who wants materials, information. Be very glad to consult on cases, as long as you don't, if offices want me to go to court, they're going to have to pay me. But, I'm very willing to give views short of that in response to case information or so forth, really without any charge, right? So I think with that, I'll stop, and wish all of you the best there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dee.